Hi, my name's Ian Wallace. I call myself the Messed Up Counsellor, which is quite an intriguing name. And the podcast you're about to see is one of many, and we've been doing about a year now. So you can look back and see all the things we've talked about with guests and on my own over the process. A lot of the information I use in the podcast initially came from the first book I wrote in 2011. Why do we do that? What do we do about it? And that came out and was the basis of all my learning, understanding at that time, which is going back a few years now. And that process of understanding how the world works for people, how we can alter, change and adapt it, was kind of what it was there to do with the initial stages. I've made that now an audiobook as well, so it's available on Amazon as an audio file that you can check out and you can download to your heart's content, and hopefully that will be helpful. In the podcasts, we're trying to look at all sorts of things about human interactions, human dynamics, the world, and how we might understand it more or change it more. So it gives you lots of ideas and tools in order to think about and look at different ways of being or dealing with things. And hopefully that brings people together and makes people more able to connect and communicate. Lots of topics. If you ever want to connect to me, just obviously drop me a comment on the podcast and I shall try as much as possible to reply. And if you've got any ideas of things that we might want to use on the podcasts, then please let me know. My name's Ian Wallace. Thanks for looking and thanks for listening. Hi, and welcome to another weekly podcast from Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. Today what I was going to look at is something that I made reference to previously in another podcast about 4 sessions ago, which was about anniversarial reactions, where something in the past impacts on our subconscious, and then we start particularly creating that behavioural process in the present. And how we find that, or how I find that, is kind of looking back through somebody's life and somebody's process. So what I'm going to do today is kind of give you that process and see whether or not it'll help you to understand where to find these things in our past, in our history, and also where to how to kind of exercise them and bring them to some kind of closure so that doesn't create a problem on the present. Now, obviously, this is an overview of the process and not necessarily specific to you watching. So you may have to tweak it, you might have to look at it in a different way or choose a different topic. But the process is the same, basically. The topic will change. So if, for example, somebody had a situation in their world and their life now, which they've started, and usually these things become something that happens. You'd kind of think, well, why did I do that? What was that about? Something that wasn't necessarily a structure that you would normally use or a situation you would normally react to. And those kind of things can create these anniversarial processes which come from the past and obviously impact on the present. Sometimes that's when people have children. When we become a parent, then we're more able to look at a parenting process and more able to do some kind of evaluation and comparison to how we were parented. So sometimes those things can occur with these behavioural situations that come out the blue and don't understand why I did it. So the way I work with that is that I ask the person that's in front of me in the room to kind of look at their world and their life and do a timeline. And a timeline, for those of you who don't understand what timeline is, all it is a line of time. It's self-explanatory, really. And so the timeline would start from the first earliest memories, because we're going to go back over the past and to today, basically. So we'd look at the situation scenario that was troubling them in today's process, which say might be something around I've done something impulsive, for example. Say maybe they've gone out and bought some aspect that was not reasonable to buy. expensive and they couldn't afford it, something like that. So you'd say, okay, so what was the rationale for buying that? What was the reason for buying it? And did it give you what you wanted? Some people might buy a new phone because they would like a new phone and they enjoy the new phone and they look at the new phone and they kind of work with the new phone and they get pleasure from it. Some other people will buy a new phone just because it's a new phone and they don't necessarily get pleasure from it. So these kind of things that happen where we don't achieve what we were expecting to achieve from it are the kind of things I'm talking about. So these unexpected purchases, unexpected behavioural processes that people do are usually around something to do with security and safety in their past because they're reacting to something. So if we're losing the example of buying something that we can't afford or is a random purchase, then it's not the purchase. I see that as the symptom. It's the thing that's happening, it's the thing that's been done, but it's not in itself the reason. So just like you have a headache, for example, you can take an aspirin, you can take a paracetamol, you can take a tablet, but it won't get rid of the reason for the headache. It'll just get the feeling of the headache. So the headache might come back, might kind of revisit you. So we're looking for the cause, we're looking for the origin, and that's why the timeline is helpful, because it goes back to find origins. So if somebody was coming to me in the room and saying those kind of things, I'd look at the aspects of past history. But if I was doing a timeline of everything that ever happened to them, they'd be in the room for ages, obviously, because lots of things happen. So I tend to use timelines that specifically focus on certain situations or scenarios or feelings or emotions. So I might look back on rejection, because rejection is a big thing for most human beings. We all have a problem with rejection usually. And it does incur those aspects of not being connected and having to connect to something. So that rejection process might be something I would use. Or loss in the wider context. And I mean a wider context in the sense that not necessarily people dying, but people leaving or people not being the person you needed to be when you were growing up. And that process helps us to look back and track back in their world and their life the things that come to memory, because we're using a creative tool, drawing or writing, as a timeline. Then our subconscious interacts with it. And that subconscious holds all the information it has about us, our world and our life. So as we're looking back and tracking through that person's history, psychodynamic counselling, then we kind of look back over situation scenarios where those things have occurred. So when I'm doing the timeline, and everybody can do it differently, but the way I do it is I don't want all the information that's ever happened, as I've said. So I'd be looking at rejection, possibly, or loss in this situation, because they're trying to replace something by buying something that they are not getting pleasure from or that isn't necessarily helpful for them. So by looking at that, it's a loss in some way, shape or form. So when we're looking at the timeline, I look back and I say, okay, record any situation scenario where the loss or rejection would be a feature of your world and your life. And I ask them to log the age, the where, because I'm looking for anniversarial situations. And I log who was involved, because I'm looking if there's any pattern in the people that's presented today to their world. And a brief understanding what happened. And I ask them to plot that back all the way through their life to whatever they can remember. Now, for most of us, our understanding of the world, understanding of how the world works and how we react to the world is given to us by other people. We're not born with the world. That process means that all those people have given us information, understanding of how the world works. And we're going to use that as our foremost understanding. Certainly if we trust the person, say a parental figure, can be other people, obviously, but, those kind of things, whereby they've given us the world. And then we kind of take that world, all of us, and that's how we assess the world. So in that first 10, 11 years of life, we're pretty much doing what we've been told we should do. Our behaviour is pretty much mimicking what other people have said is okay. And that becomes our mainstay of knowledge, understanding, and we're like sponges in those days. So we're picking up all that information via verbal, and not necessarily only verbal, facial features, interactions, what we see or we hear. So that timeline gives us a plot of those things in that person's life. Now that's interesting because people will remember things that they thought they'd forgot because we're using a creative tool. So things will come out that, I didn't remember that, And sometimes I'll ask people if they don't necessarily have memories to talk to the parents or talk to people that were close to them, siblings, to see if there's any situation scenarios. The thing from an adult's perspective is that trauma in the wider context, it can be very small from a child's perspective. You take away a child's favourite toy, for example, their kind of security blanket, then that for them is devastating. From an adult's perspective, well, I'll buy another one. Not a problem. I've got the money, I'll buy one. But from a child's perspective, it's absolutely gut-wrenching. So that will have an impact on their world, naturally, and how they see it and how they react and respond to it. So we're looking at those kind of situations all the way through their life. And if, for example, somebody every 3 or 4 years had a rejection or a disconnection or some kind of loss, say a child was moving from place to place in the country because the parents had jobs where they had to move, then that child would basically lose every time they'd created those kind of relationships around them, maybe school friends, maybe people around them, maybe things they did, and that would be taken away from them through no fault of their own and no choice of their own. And that, if every 4 years, 3 or 4 years, that happened, then what we can do, not everybody, but what we can do is we then can create a process of rejection. We can push people away. We can make people's relationships hard to have with us. We can be more security conscious with our children, for example. So these things happen, and they do happen to an awful lot of people. And when we're doing that, when we're looking at that timeline and that anniversarial process, all these things become much more easier to spot than doing a verbal conversation because it's down on paper, and there's something about being down on paper that makes it more real. I know it's the same, but it does make it more real. And so when people are doing timelines, when they're kind of working those processes, it's good to let them know that this might be an emotional journey for them and that they may find feelings and emotions in there that they weren't expecting, because it can be kind of hard to do, yeah? And as we're doing that process, as we're looking for those connections, those similarities, those processes of reconnection or deconnection, then we kind of see the patterns. And when I'm looking at the patterns, pretty much things jump out at me. I don't know if that's the same for everybody, but being dyslexic, as I've said in a previous podcast, patterns are really very easy to spot for dyslexic people, usually. So those patterns kind of become easier to spot, easier to see. Now, for the person in front of me that I'm working with, obviously this will be kind of really weird. That something in our subconscious can impact on our present day, but it does time and time again. So I see that as being the truth because I see it in the room time and time again. So I don't necessarily understand it. I can't give you the theory behind it, but I know it's a reality that people come across. So if, for example, in that timeline, they at 16 years old, for example, had some kind of major effect on their world and their life. Maybe the parents moved, or they didn't get to where they wanted to be, or the exams they were being, or feeling they were being criticised about. Those kind of things can create disturbance. What happens then, or can happen, should I say, is that when we have a child that becomes 16, then we can go into the same emotional trauma. Now, it will obviously be experienced differently in a sense that we might have a different behaviour from it. We might not be passing exams, for example. But we might put in place some process of more security in our lives when our child gets to 16. So we may have a reaction all of a sudden of saying, right, okay, where are you going? What are you doing? I need to put a tracker on your phone. Now, okay, a lot of people see that as a natural thing at 16 because kids are getting adult and kids do what kids do. But it might also be enforced by this process of security and safety that they experienced when they were 16. Now, that might be that they've never engaged with that behaviour before with their child, and then all of a sudden it becomes a big deal. They will be working that anniversarial process without even realising it. Now, the effect on that child, obviously, that they have might be major. They might see this as being claustrophobic. They might see it as being over dictatorship. I don't know if that's a word or not. Yes, I think it is. Dyslexic brain goes into gear. So they might then react to that quite naturally because it's never been said before. This is a new process, but it's a new process that the parent's doing because of their process when they were 16. So these things are things that happen. They are normal for most human beings. But they're not necessarily easy to explain or understand. So the timeline process helps you to do that. Now, once we've done the timeline and we've seen their behavioural pattern, if you like, then what we need to do is try to release the cause. Because if we release the cause, then there should be no kind of reaction of symptom. So it should be that relaxes that situation scenario, so they don't necessarily have to buy the next phone because they understand and bring into conscious that process. They can take charge of it, take control of it, whereas subconscious we're never in control of. It's just a purely reactionary thing. And so that process helps us to understand our drives, as we call it, and our situation scenarios. Then what we do is we look back in the life of that person, and what I ask them to do is grade each experience on this timeline in a scoring pattern of 0 to 10. And from today's perspective, you won't be able to remember at the time how you felt about things, but we need a common denominator, if you like. So I ask them to record that in 1 to 10, or 0 to 10, should I say. 10 being the worst affected from today's kind of situation and 0 being the least affected. And I do that because if we're going to release those triggers, those kind of behavioural processes, those situation scenarios, I want to do it with the least affected first, because that will get them into the process of what we're doing, and it shouldn't be as emotionally disturbing. And then we work our way up to the larger numbers. Now, if, for example, on that timeline scoring, they had 2 at number 6 or 3 at number 6, then I would ask them to do 6, 1, 6, 2, 6, 3. So we're still doing that kind of elevating process of numbers, because I need each individual situation to be a separate number, because I can only work with one thing at a time, basically. So if we look at that process and say a 3-year-old, their mum or dad left the relationship or were contemplating leaving in the relationship, that disconnection, that loss or possible loss, and that was the lowest number to start with, then what I would do is ask them to write a letter to either the person or the situation scenario or the feeling of the emotion. It's up to them what they write to, because we need them to be in charge of the process as much as possible. So if, for example, they wrote a letter to the parental figure who was due to leave or going to leave or did leave, then that letter is created a process of connection with that time, which is good. It's getting the feelings and emotions that drive us out in the letter because we're telling that person how we feel about them at that time. And once we've finished the letter, then we kind of destroy it in any way, shape or form that's appropriate. Because that destroying it brings some kind of closure, some kind of process of ending, if you like, and being in charge of the ending. Because obviously at the 3-year-old, they would not have been in charge of that process. So it's kind of moving through that timeline one by one, situation by situation, in that graded process until we get up to the really difficult ones. And hopefully by that time, we've got used to the process. We haven't got as many experiential, emotional issues around it because we've done closure as we're going up that process. And so when we get to the big numbers, hopefully the other things won't be part of that impact and we'll be able to see it much more easier. Once we've done that process, and the client does that on their own, not necessarily in the room, we don't need to kind of work with it as a counsellor and client. We can leave it for them to do in their own time, in their own place. And that process means that they will be more relaxed and more able to carry it out. If they try and rush it or work it to our agenda of time as a session, then that might not necessarily be the most helpful. So those things they do at their own choice and design and time. And the only thing I say to them is if you've scored something low in your timeline and you find when you're writing to whatever you're writing to, you have a really major reaction, then I do want to have a conversation in the room with you about that because it's not as you would expect it to be. Similarly, if they recorded a high number and they had very little reaction, again, I'd want to talk about that in the therapy to see why that is the case. Because there may be something that is blocking it, or there might be something else within it that they're not able to see or understand. So when I'm working with timelines, I find that they are really helpful for lots and lots of different situations, to be fair. I don't do it for every client, obviously, only the ones that there's a rationale for using it. But if we can work that process of life where those things have been affecting that person, then they will hopefully come out through it with less of a reaction. They might still have a reaction because it might be ingrained in their psyche. But I'm a great believer if we take something from a subconscious process, a reaction, into a conscious process where we have choice, then we can then take charge of that and we can alter the future. So if, for example, they had that reoccurring pattern of this disconnection, as I've said, and they put their process in today's world in that next anniversarial 4-year pattern, then once we know that pattern, we can then say, okay, in 3 to 4 years' time, I need to be really a bit careful about my interactions with other people. I need to see whether or not I am still doing that pushing people away, that detachment stuff, and then take charge of my reactions and make some conscious choices of not pushing away, but instead connecting. And then we'll build up a different pattern. Now, it might take a while to do that, obviously not while they're working necessarily with me, because once they've got that idea or understanding, then they can do that on their own. They don't need me as a therapist. I've just given them the tools and the process in order to take charge and control of their life. And then it's their life, it's not my life. So from that point of view, they can be more consciously aware of that aspect of anniversarial cycle. Yeah. Now, the trauma doesn't have to be one individual thing. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So if something was a drip, drip, drip effect, then that can still build up the same kind of reaction. So I'll give an example of that. So if somebody came to me saying that they want to understand why they don't take leadership roles, for example, at work. So they've been offered them, but they don't take them. There's something about them that says, I can't do it or I don't want to do it. And they can't find any reasonably understanding why, because they're competent at their job, they've got the skills, the abilities, but they still kind of reject it. Then what could happen, and I say all these are scenarios that I have found in the room with clients, but I'm not saying these are the only things that can happen. So what could happen is if, for example, a parental figure, as I've said, growing up, every time you go out or they take you out, they're questioning, have you got the right shoes on? Have you got the right clothes on? Are you warm enough? Have you taken a brolly? Have you got your lunch? Have you got? Then that constant drip feed, which the parental figure is doing because they want to keep you safe, keep you warm, make you okay, will possibly build up a process as they grow up and become an adult of not taking leadership, because there's always that question in the back of the mind from that anniversarial cycle of, do I need to check this with a third party? And managers, generally speaking, won't need to check things with a third party. They'll just take their own decisions and pretty much work them. But if we've always been constantly told you have to check, you have to make sure, you have to have 2 or 3 checks, then that process may engage with them in this keeping themselves back, not taking those leadership roles, being in the background, supporting other people. Now, I'm not saying that's the case every time, but it might do. So if we've got that kind of inferred criticism, if you like, not because the person's a bad person, the parental figure, but because they just want to keep the person safe, then that can lead to all sorts of scenarios for the future. It could make you more focused on safety and security. It could make you more focused on attachment issues. It might make you more focused on clinging on to people instead of taking leads and roles. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but if you've got a partner who you're always asking them to take responsibility for everything that ever happens because you won't make a decision, eventually that might cause a problem in the relationship. So check these things out. And if you find you're doing something that you look and you think, why did I do that? And you can't find an explanation, or not one that immediately comes to mind, try this timeline tool and see whether or not it works. You may find things out that you didn't realise by yourself, which is usually the case. I've done it myself, obviously, when I was working through training and such like, where we kind of practice on ourselves, human guinea pigs of ourselves. And it's brought out some really interesting features whereby I've changed my world, my life, my interactive process to make my life and other people's lives around me easier. So hopefully that made sense. With these things, as always, I can only give you my view. It's not the view. I will never be an expert. I don't believe there is any experts, because to me an expert means you can't learn anymore, and I'm constantly learning in the work I do, and I've done that over 20 odd years, so I'm still learning. So hopefully it makes sense and it helps you to understand these reaction behaviours, and you can move forward and you can take charge and control of your life. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. And if this has been interesting to you, please like, share, send it on to other people. After all, you've no idea what people are coping with usually. And it may just help your friends, your relatives to understand some of their world as well. Thanks so much for listening and watching. Take care. Hi, thanks for listening to the podcast, and hopefully it made sense and was interesting for you. Please subscribe, like and share. With the podcasts, you never know who will be helped by the things we talk about, things we share. We don't normally tell people our problems, but by sharing it and helping other people to understand things. The book Insecurity, It's All About Me, is also available now through Amazon. And it gives you an understanding of what drives insecurity, how insecurity works within our human dynamics, and how you can get a much more secure connection with people. It gives you lots of ideas and thoughts, which is really good. So thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, share, hit the button. And if you've got any comments, please give me them and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks very much. Take care.